Okay. So I also write this Substack, which is called The Good Apocalypse Guide. I love talking about apocalypses, so that's what I'm going to start by doing. So one thing you need to know about me is ever since I was about this high, I've always been a bit of a secret prepper. When I was about 10 years old, my absolute favorite book was this little paperback called How to Survive. And it had all these sort of, tips and tricks for how to sort of stay alive in any situation. And it's a bit weird looking back on it, how I ended up like that. But I think it was just growing up in the 80s, acid rain, holes in the ozone layer, nuclear saber rattling. And I think at some level, my 10-year-old self thought that having a little survival kit with a whistle and a compass and a fishing line would be useful if there was a nuclear winter. And as time went by, I never really grew out of it. My wife, Emma, still loves to tease me about the time when news of the global financial crisis broke in 2008. I immediately logged on to Tesco.com and panic bought this enormous survival stash. But unfortunately, it turned out other people had had the same idea because when the delivery arrived, they'd substituted almost everything in my voluminous trolley for red lentils, which is not a food that we eat in our house. So to my wife's absolute glee and delight, when we moved out years later, they were all still there on shelving. But the thing is that as time has gone by over the years since then, this has seemed less like a sort of slightly daft eccentricity and more like a sort of, fairly reasonable response to the state of the world. Because as we can all see, every time we unlock our phones or look at a newspaper, we're living in a time of permacrisis. There's sort of war going on right now between major powers. The world has more refugees and internally displaced people now than at any time ever in history. We've had a massive pandemic in just the last few years. Inequality between the world's richest and poorest just gets wider every single year. Artificial intelligence is coming for our jobs and running something called the autonomous battlefield. And if that phrase doesn't give you chills, I don't know what will. And of course, in the background, we've got climate breakdown happening. It is a lot. So it's kind of no wonder in some ways that in the last few years, both permacrisis and polycrisis have been official words of the year, according to the Oxford and Cambridge English dictionaries. But I prefer the word apocalypse. Now, immediately, some of you are going to be thinking, apocalypse? What are you talking about? I mean, things may be a bit turbulent at the moment, but look at some of the situations our ancestors faced. I mean, during the Black Death, a third of the population of Europe died. And of course, in the 20th century, we've seen unimaginable catastrophes like the Holocaust or the killing fields or Rwanda's genocide. And of course, it is correct that where we are now is nothing in comparison to those past cataclysms. I mean, billions of us, not everybody, of course, but billions of people today live lives of kind of unparalleled luxury by historical standards. We're kind of warm, safe, well-fed. We've got access to all the information in the world in our little computers in our pockets. Apocalypse? But here's the thing that I think gets to the nub of the weird times we're living through. Things are getting better and they're getting worse at the same time. All the lines on all the graphs are going vertical. It's true of good stuff like computing power or life expectancy or medical science, and it's true of bad stuff like carbon dioxide concentrations or, conflict deaths are going up again, and so on and so on. And that means that we all live all the time with this weird cognitive dissonance. We go about our everyday lives and it's kind of drop the kids at school, get to the gym, maybe catch up on emails, think about where we might be wanting to go on holiday this summer. Oh my goodness, the wildfires. And it just suddenly catches you that you're living in very, very weird times. I think this quote from Daniel Schmachtenberger, who's an American systems theorist, really gets to the nub of this. He says, if things are getting exponentially better and worse at the same time, then that doesn't mean things are getting better or worse. It means the current system is destabilizing. It means things are unsustainable in the very literal sense that they won't be sustained. So in that sense, maybe it's no surprise that references of the word apocalyptic in books are the highest they've been for years, 6 times higher than they were in 1960, and as high as they've been since the middle of the 19th century when the American Civil War was happening and lots of people were writing about it there. Apocalypses are on our minds. They're sort of out there in the popular imagination. But here's the thing. I think we have apocalypses all wrong. If you watch apocalypse movies, and I may have watched all of them, to learn about what happens in an apocalypse, there are kind of 3 key lessons that Hollywood wants to tell you about. The first is that other people are a complete liability in an apocalypse. What happens when the zombies strike or any other kind of cataclysm strikes is you immediately have total breakdown of law and order, mass panic, and things just unravel from there until thankfully the army come along and declare martial law. That means by extension that the resilience strategy you need in an apocalypse is as much canned food as possible, and preferably ammunition as well if you can get your hands on it. And ideally, third, you will also have a survival bunker like this one in 10 Cloverfield Lane. And of course, as we know, tech bros like Sam Altman and Peter Thiel are doing exactly this. They're buying up large tracts of New Zealand to build themselves apocalypse bunkers. The thing is, luckily, that what Hollywood tells us about what happens in an apocalypse is complete nonsense. Actually, it turns out that disasters bring out the best of us like almost nothing else. People show up for each other. They're kind, often heroic with it, showing incredible selflessness. And what you often see is a response that psychologists call tend and befriend. It's when you're tending to yourself and your immediate family group, and then befriending other people to help you do the tending. And of course, we saw a lovely example of this recently. Do you remember in the first COVID lockdown when suddenly, without any central coordination, mutual aid groups started springing up all over the place? Again, communities showing up for each other in apocalyptic conditions. Apocalypse doesn't even mean the end of the world, whatever Hollywood says. As we know, as Christians, apocalypse comes from the Greek word apocalypsis, meaning a revelation, a moment of unveiling, a moment where what is actually true gets disclosed. And I think that is a really interesting point, and it unlocks the whole idea that apocalyptic times, times of turbulence and crisis, can be very, very creative. They can be incubators for new futures. And we see this all through history. If you look at the Warring States period in China, which was from about 900 to about 200 BCE, time of complete upheaval and turbulence, but also the soil from which Confucianism and Taoism sprang. And of course, in our own tradition, if you take the time when the Israelites were exiled to Babylon, that was again an amazingly creative period that produced, for instance, Jeremiah and Isaiah. A little closer to now, I mentioned the Black Death earlier. A third of the population of Europe died, but also the period that led to the Renaissance, this amazing cultural flowering. And in the lifetimes of people still alive today, we've seen the carnage of the Second World War, the Holocaust, which I mentioned, the first use of an atom bomb, but that was the soil from which things like the United Nations and universal human rights came. So here's the point I'm trying to make here, and this is going to bring us to the whole thing of how Christians can be peacemakers. I think apocalyptic moments can lead to breakdown and unraveling, but they can also lead to breakthrough. And I'm really, really interested in what tips the balance between those two. Now, for a lot of time in my career, I worked in politics. I worked as a special advisor to 2 ministers. I worked in the UN Secretary General's office. I worked for lots of think tanks. And all that time, I thought that the future was being made in rooms like this, that this is where the balance between breakdown and breakthrough would be decided. But the more time I spent in rooms like that, the more I realized this is not where the real power is. The real power is with ordinary people like us, because we are the ones that basically determine the political space that the politicians operate within. And in particular, what's really important is what's going on in our heads. Our states of mind and the state of the world are linked together. They influence and shape and create each other in all sorts of interesting ways. And if we want to make this a breakthrough apocalypse, and if we want to get to grips with things like authoritarian populism and how it's tearing through our politics at the moment, it's these loops between our states of mind and the state of the world that we really need to understand. And I want to talk about two ways that state of mind and state of world can influence and shape each other. Here is the first one. This is the gloomy one. At Larger Us, the organization I run, we call it a breakdown loop. And this is what we see around us a lot at the moment. What happens in a breakdown loop is that we look out at the state of the world, we open our phones or whatever, and what we see is things getting worse. Crisis after crisis. The future seems darker than the past. Everything seems a bit hopeless. And of course, that affects our states of mind over on the right-hand side. The more we're seeing this steady drumbeat of crisis and unraveling, the more it makes us feel anxious and depressed and threatened and hopeless and all of the rest of it. Now, obviously, that's really bad for our mental health, but it's also really bad for our politics, because how we feel inside then shapes how we show up as citizens. If we're feeling, at the bottom, insecure and exposed, it is the perfect breeding ground for things like prejudice and hostility and conflict. And as we then fragment and polarize and have culture wars and all the stuff that we keep seeing in our politics, we are much less well equipped to actually do anything constructive about the state of the world, because the apocalyptic issues we're up against require us to come together. But polarization is meaning that we're doing the opposite. So you can see how the stage is set for a really vicious circle, where the state of the world impacts our states of mind and makes us show up as citizens in ways that make the state of the world even worse. And round the cycle we go. You know who loves this cycle? Divisive populists and extremists. It's absolute catnip for them. And in a minute, I'm going to get into unpacking exactly how they manipulate it so expertly. But before that, let's imagine the opposite. Let's imagine that we reverse the polarity of this cycle. Imagine a situation where every time you unlock your phone, you're starting to see ways in which the state of the world is getting better. We're actually making some progress in addressing these massive issues that we're up against right now. And then think about how that makes us feel. Instead of feeling anxious and hopeless and threatened, we start to feel confident and hopeful and open towards each other. And as we do that, we show up totally differently as citizens. We become less polarized. We become better able to cooperate and actually solve these big problems. And then instead of the vicious circle we had a moment ago, you have a virtuous spiral where improvements in the state of the world are leading to us feeling better in our states of mind, that lead to us showing up differently as citizens, and further improvements in the state of the world, and so on. So, how and where does that, again, that tipping point between breakdown and breakthrough get decided? What I want to talk about now is 5 front lines right at the cusp of state of world and state of mind that I think are where the future is going to be decided. And in each case, I'm going to talk about how populists and extremists exploit that front line, what a more positive alternative might look like, and how we as Christians are really, really well placed to show up and help that process and help tip the balance towards breakthrough. So here are the 5 front lines. I'll rattle through them and then we'll take a minute on each one. The first one is all about how we respond to threats, to things that scare or outrage us. The second one is whether we feel like we belong, like we're connected, valued, seen. The third one is whether we recognize what we share with each other in spite of all of the things that make us different from each other. The fourth one, really important, how we deal with experiences of loss, particularly shared loss. And then fifth and finally, what kind of stories we tell about where we are, where we're trying to get to, how to get there, and above all, about who we are. So let me start with the first one, how we respond to threats. Now, all of us here know how it feels physically when your amygdala in your brain takes you into a fight, flight, freeze state. You know that feeling? Your heart starts to pound. You can feel the adrenaline coursing into your bloodstream. If you're faced with physical danger, it's a superbly honed system for keeping you alive. I remember this because when I was an undergrad, I got attacked on the street in Edinburgh. And my fight, flight, freeze instinct kicked in, and I was just running to safety before my conscious mind even knew what was happening. It was this extraordinary thing, this kind of deep animal part of my brain just kicked in, got me to safety, just brushed the conscious mind aside. Really good for physical danger. Much less good for dealing with political disagreements. When we're in a fight, flight, freeze state, as well as all the physiological impacts, various things are happening in our heads. We get less empathetic immediately. We become more aggressive. We lock into our selfish kind of personal self-interest or the interests of whatever in-group that we see ourselves as part of. And we also become immediately much less good at telling the difference between what is real and what is hypothetical or illusory or a conspiracy theory. You can see why populists absolutely love this stuff. And if you go to a MAGA rally, it's basically like a kind of Glastonbury of fight, flight, freeze. The whole thing is designed to trigger you and get you right on the edge and, ready to fight or flee for your life. And it's all to do with what part of our brain kicks in when we feel threatened. I already mentioned the amygdala, little almond-shaped part of the brain right down at the bottom there. That's the part that on autopilot takes you into fight, flight, freeze. But with practice, and it does take work, you can get your amygdala out of the driving seat and into the passenger seat and let your prefrontal cortex take charge, which is the more reflective, considered, empathetic part of your brain. Much more sensible and pro-social for dealing with political disagreements. But it does take the practice. You know who really trains for getting their amygdala out of the way and responding with prefrontal cortexes? People like first responders. They are at the sharp end and know the risks of what happens when panic or overwhelm overtakes you in the moment. And so they train with simple things like kind of basically techniques lifted from contemplative practice to slow their minds down. And it turns out, isn't this fascinating, that it's not just first responders who now need this skill, it's all of us if we want democracy to function as it's intended. And you know who else is really good at training people in these kind of techniques? The people who've been doing it longer than anybody, it's churches. I mean, this is my home church. This is Bolton Priory in Yorkshire. I should explain there's a part behind that does actually have a roof. We don't worship in a ruin. But this was a monastery until 1539, and the monks there were training every day in the same sort of contemplative techniques that first responders have adapted in the 21st century. This contemplative prayer is a really good way of untriggering when you do it as a daily practice. So I think that's one example of an amazing gift we have in Christianity that turns out to be kind of relevant to where we are now. Second one is whether we feel like we belong. I think we're probably all familiar with the idea that we're living through a so-called epidemic of loneliness, and also with the idea that this is really bad for our mental health. A statistic that often gets bandied around is that being chronically lonely is as bad for your mental health as bad for life expectancy as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. But here's the thing, chronic loneliness is really bad for democracies as well. One of the people who spotted this first was Hannah Arendt, the great writer about how Germany lapsed into fascism. And in her book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, which came out in 1951, she observed that people who feel isolated are much more vulnerable to authoritarian views, to supporting totalitarian regimes. And she went one step further and said, and that is why totalitarian regimes deliberately try to create and maximize isolation, to keep citizens separate from each other. And in our own times, one of the things that strikes me is whenever you see extremist groups, be that the English Defence League, or the Proud Boys, or Hizb ut-Tahrir, or incel networks, what you always find is that they're preying on people's need to belong. And what they're offering them is kind of a form of belonging. It's a twisted form of belonging that's based on who is excluded, but it is a form of belonging. And one of the things that frustrates the hell out of me working with lots of big charities who we work with at Larger Us is they've got so much opportunity to build belonging and they never take advantage of it. Instead, it's sign this petition, write to your MP, give us £5 a month, now go away until we need you. But if we were building that belonging, that would be building resilience to kind of polarization and division and populism. We need more belonging in our society, and churches are so good at building it. It's another one of the gifts that we have to offer in this situation. And not just in church, but taking that kind of culture of welcome out into society and reconnecting us to each other, not just for our mental health, not just for our physical health, but for the health of the democracies we all live in. The third front line between breakdown and breakthrough is all about whether we recognize what we share with each other. I love this cartoon. This explains the psychological concept of in-group bias very well. In-group bias is a cognitive bias that all of us have, and it means whenever we see ourselves as part of a group, we have this innate tendency to regard other members of the same group more favorably and to give them preferential treatment. Now, this is not always bad. 2 years ago, I took my daughter, who's now just turned 16, to see the Eras tour. It was the cutest thing I've ever seen. I mean, we live in the absolute middle of nowhere in Yorkshire. There are no other Swifties in probably a 5-mile radius. And suddenly Isabel was with her people. It was beautiful to see her sort of feel this sense of being part of something bigger, swapping the bracelets with everyone. Perfect illustration of in-group bias. No one was harmed in this production of in-group bias. It is not always bad. But as soon as you get into the political realm, in-group bias starts to become very problematic indeed. This is absolute ground zero for kind of conflict, for tribalism, for just about every form of prejudice you can think of, and so on. It is a really big part of why our politics is the bin fire that we see on the news each day. How do we overcome this? One of the things we talk about a lot at Larger Us is just the power of the simple, curious conversation. When we show up for conversations with respect and curiosity and just ask people open-ended questions and invite them sort of forth. Someone I know who I think is an amazing pioneer at this is a guy called Dave Fleischer, LGBTQ activist in Los Angeles. Back in 2008, they lost a statewide referendum on equal marriage in California. Lots of Dave's activists were absolutely furious and wanted to go out on the street and shout. Dave did something different. He went to the most conservative district in LA and just started ringing doorbells and just having conversations with people. He wasn't calling them out. He wasn't there to argue with them. He just wanted to understand, like, I don't get why they voted for this thing that is so obviously common sense to me. And by showing up in that way, he created a space where over and over he found that it was possible to find common ground. He would always say, I didn't change their minds. They changed their own minds when they came to see some of the contradictions in their points of view. It's a beautiful example of just the power of encounter. And I think another really important part of this is expanding what Albert Einstein called our circles of compassion. And this is really about how big is the us that we identify with. Do we see us as just like my friends and family, or quotes, people like me? Or does that circle of compassion go wider to include maybe all 8 billion of us and other species and future generations of both? Because right now, in these apocalyptic conditions, it's really important that we're identifying with an us as large as that. And again, churches are so well placed to do this, particularly the bridging part. I wanted to share this story. This is another church that I know very well near me in Leeds. All Hallows Church in Leeds, the Hyde Park area of Leeds, the most activisty church I've ever seen. And they have this wonderful story. So what happened last September, I guess it was, is there's a hotel in the Seacroft area of Leeds, which is a pretty kind of poor, pretty white area. And in that hotel, the Britannia Hotel, are currently living 75 asylum seekers, all of whom happen to be male. You can imagine what happened then. Immediately you had kind of far-right protesters turning up outside the hotel, waving St. George's flags, shouting Islamophobic abuse at the hotel. And then almost immediately, counter-demonstrations started happening on the opposite side of the street, organized by Stand Up Against Racism, and then lots of police in the middle. So you've now got two sides of protesters and counter-protesters, both shouting at each other across the street, and a lot of traumatized refugees in the hotel behind, just terrified by the whole situation. It would have been the most natural thing in the world for the people at All Hallows to join in the Stand Up Against Racism demonstration. They're so involved in work to support refugees. They're so involved in anti-racist work. But what they decided was that the most useful thing they could do was actually to bake a whole lot of cakes with the little St. George's flags, nice touch, and use them to start conversations with everybody, with the far-right protesters, with the counter-protesters, with the police, take some into the hotel as well, because they discovered that actually just asking people, would you like some cake, is a really easy way into a conversation. Everybody loves cake. Obviously, there was a lot of joking there about the old Eddie Izzard sketch, the cake or death one, if you know that sketch. Anyway, what they found was that this was an incredibly successful tactic at doing a couple of things. The first was just dialing down the temperature a little bit, getting everyone to just slow down and take a breath. But also, more fundamentally, it was a very effective way of resisting dehumanization. Through their actions, what they were kind of living out was just the point that all of us are made in the image of God. All of us are fallen and broken. All of us have innate worth in God's eyes, and that's what they were kind of expressing with the cakes. And the transformational potential of this is such that they have managed to get people to sit down from the far right and from the anti-racist groups for private, off-the-record conversations, to just start to listen to and hear each other. It's having a really, really deep impact. Okay, we need to move on. Number 4, how we deal with loss. Okay, every time we unlock our phones, there are all sorts of loss. We're living through a time of enormous loss, whether it's the cost of living, whether it's the loss of kind of confidence in the future, the loss of certainty, or more tangible, local forms of loss. We work in lots of different parts of the UK at Larger Us, and many places where we work have high streets that look like this. And of course, that gives people a very tangible, felt sense of loss that leaves them kind of really mourning. Enter, of course, the populists, who are so good at funneling people down what we call the grief to grievance pipeline. They absolutely lean into that sense of loss and turn it into a feeling of grievance. There's a really interesting psychiatrist whose work we're obsessed with, a guy called Vamik Volkan. Vamik is 94 years old, Cypriot, psychiatrist and conflict mediator. And he's one of the world's top experts in the psychology of shared loss. And what he says in a nutshell is that whenever a society experiences shared loss and doesn't grieve for it properly, then it basically starts to become part of group identity. And it's just perfect for a manipulative political leader to come along and turn into grievance. We can see this happening everywhere. If you look at Donald Trump, his core narrative, Make America Great Again, is a narrative of shared loss and grievance. It's all about how America used to be great and it isn't anymore, and it's someone's fault. If you look at Vladimir Putin, the way he was able to build support for his war in Ukraine was all about playing on people's experiences of shared loss since the demise of the Soviet Union, this feeling of loss of prestige and loss of respect, as well as loss of standard of living. So what do you do to defuse the grief to grievance pipeline? Well, it is all about grieving. I love this story. This is the story, it's not a very good photo really, but it's the story of a thing that happened called Glasgow's Lament, which was a grief ritual that happened in Glasgow a few years back, when everyone was frazzled after the UN climate summit had taken place there. And a woman called Tess Humble, who's a community organizer who we know at Larger Us, decided that she wanted to organize a place where people could share things that they were grieving. And what was really interesting about this ritual was that different people were grieving different things. So there were people like young kids, like 19 or 20, whose families had lived in Glasgow for generations, and what they were mourning was people they'd known who died of drugs overdoses, or who maybe had taken their own lives. Also present at the grief ritual were people who had recently arrived in the UK as asylum seekers who were grieving something totally different, like, for example, friends who hadn't made it during the crossing over the Sahara or across the Mediterranean. So they were grieving these really different things, but they found that in the expression of the grief, they were able to find emotional common ground with each other. And they were able to grieve together. And then she's got this beautiful quote, which is in the article that we wrote about it at the time, that when you grieve collectively, something in you knows when it's time to cry and when it's time to stop. There's just something about doing it collectively. And the thing that I find most beautiful about this is that by bringing together young asylum seekers and young people who lived in Glasgow their whole lives, these are exactly the two communities that populists try to pit against each other all the time. And by leaning into grief, what Tess was able to do was enable them to find a shared emotional kind of foundation. Again, this is something that churches are so well placed to lead in communities. I mean, like, we literally wrote the book on Lamentations, right? So, something we could be doing there. Fifth and finally, what kind of stories do we tell in an apocalypse? The thing about the human brain is that we like to think that it's a logic processor, but as the writer Jonathan Haidt points out, it is not. It is a story processor. As humans, this is how we make sense of the world. And the bit that I'm most interested in is that in apocalyptic conditions, or whenever there's any kind of crisis, the stories we pick to make sense of what is going on have very deep power to become self-fulfilling prophecies, to create our reality rather than just describe it. If that sounds abstract, let me give you a very tangible example. A run on a bank. A run on a bank happens when a story begins to circulate that the bank doesn't have enough money to cover everyone's withdrawals. If enough people believe the story, they start to act accordingly, in this case by forming a queue outside the bank. And what started as a rumor has suddenly become reality. This is how stories create reality rather than just describing it. So if the kinds of stories that we are reaching for in times of crisis, in apocalyptic conditions, are stories about some threatening other, and we need to build bigger walls to keep them out, those are very dangerous stories to have circulating if too many people believe those stories, because the risk is that then people start to act accordingly. So we need different stories, stories that talk about how we come together in times of crisis, how we rise to the moment and find our way through together. I love this graph. I find it endlessly fascinating. This is a graph from the bit of the Department of Homeland Security in the United States that deals with disaster preparedness. And what this graph shows is the emotional stages that communities and societies go through in the wake of massive disasters. So you can see that, over here the society is going tum-ty-tum-ty-tum, impact, disaster strikes. Now here's the weird bit. As soon as disaster strikes, instead of plunging into kind of panic and disillusionment, you have this amazing spike. Like what is often happening is societies go through an emotional high. The emotions are kind of like, it's so great that everyone's like really showing up for each other. It's kind of almost a bit exhilarating. Very much like that first COVID lockdown where everyone was like, wow, it's so great. We're all showing up for each other. And it's like the Blitz spirit and all of that kind of thing. Unfortunately, that stage of disaster does not last. Typically what happens is societies then go into the disillusionment stage where people are just exhausted. This is very much like the second COVID lockdown. They're realizing how much is not going to go back to how it was before disaster. And money and relationship and health worries are all crowding in, and people just feel completely spent. But then what happens is that societies or communities find their way through to a reconstruction phase where they're starting to rebuild, they're regaining a sense of agency and purpose. And what these disaster planners say is the X factor that unlocks that. It's all about story. That when communities get to this point, they start to develop a new story of how the community came together and rose to that moment and charted a new way forward. And when you've got loads of crises crowding in at once, like the poly crisis we're living through, it really matters that we find the right kind of story. And again, churches are very good repositories of deep stories. I'm going to finish with this. This is, of course, the sycamore tree on Sycamore Gap, which was cut down but is now kind of from the stump growing back to life. It's a kind of resurrection motif. And it reminds me of how the Bible, if you take the entire thing, the story arc from Genesis 2 through to Revelation, 21, is the story of a tree of life that we lose access to and then regain access to in the very last chapter. It's a restoration narrative, and I think restoration narratives have really deep power during apocalyptic moments, along with narratives about what is being revealed and what might be trying to be born. So again, as Christians, we have a lot to offer there in terms of deep stories that can help us to make sense of apocalyptic times where it feels like we're living through total upheaval. So there are the 5 front lines again. How we respond to threats, whether we feel like we belong, whether we recognize what we share, how we deal with loss, and what kind of stories we tell. If we want to find our way through to a breakthrough apocalypse, or if at a more kind of day-to-day level, we just want to resist the rise of the far right and the lure of kind of authoritarian populism and extremism, that battle is going to be won or lost in our heads as much as out there in politics and so on. And the more we are not just in our own minds, but together, coming together to help other people to build their capacities on these 5 areas, the more we're nudging things through to a good apocalypse. I'm going to stop there. Thanks.